Edna O'Brien. Next week, her guest is Dr. Jonathan Miller.
I had some smidgen of understanding or belief in the notion of God in the first place, and as it were, that atheism implied that I had considered the subject and found it wanting and had rejected it, or the concept. And I must say that my atheism was never like that. It was simply something I never thought about at all. The concept never entered my imagination.
When you were a child, was there never any stage at which the idea of God or the need for God actually crossed your path?
At no point at all. I've raked over the embers of childhood memory to find if there's any sort of fragment of something which was once a thought on the subject. And unless I'm being willfully amnesic, I really can't find anything that I can remember in the way of a thought on the topic.
I just think from teaching at school. You must have had
Yes, I heard people talk about it in a way that I had heard poems about Jabberwocks. But I didn't think much about Jabberwocks. There were illustrations of Jabberwocks in Alice in Wonderland, but once I had closed the book, beyond the domain of the written account of Jabberwocks, it wasn't something which I thought I had to think about as being part of the real world. It was in the domain of literature. It was in the domain of Bibles and scripture and Bible studies and prayers. There was all this stuff coming up. But it seemed completely non-referential to me. It did not point to, refer to anything.
And your parents weren't religious?
No, both my parents were Jewish, whatever one means by that, for people who don't believe. I mean, racially Jewish, ethnically Jewish, whatever that means. And I'm even doubtful about that now. My father was, I think, closer to his ethnic roots than my mother, and although he was never religious, he felt some sort of obligation to cleave to the religious practices because of loyalty to an embattled and persecuted group. My mother was a passionate agnostic and atheist. She was irritated and angered by what was done in its name. And I suppose I was affected by her attitude to it, and by my father's non-committal indifference to the theology.
Yes, with that background, it would have been quite strange if you had become a believer, I imagine.
Well, you might say that, I mean, people often say that many of the most important aspects of a personality are formed by peer group pressures rather than parental instruction. And therefore, being surrounded by young Christians at school and by Christian masters, that I would have imbibed some sort of religion. But it was something that happened on the edge, like the sports that I never did. I mean, I didn't do rugby, and I didn't do prayers. I didn't do Christianity. It wasn't one of my half activities.
Did you need to find explanations for things? I mean, most children do. I mean, how the world was made, even when you're 5, 6, 7. Did you never think, where did this all come from? Who made it?
Oh, if I had any thought about origins and causes and so forth, I don't think I ever traced it back to human agency or ever thought about human agency. There must have been a time, I suppose, when I was 4 or 5 years old when, like any child, I had animistic ideas about what made clouds move and thought that they were probably moving because they wanted to go places. But I don't think that I ever thought that the universe was the product of intentional design, and therefore that behind it lay some sort of quasi-human agency. And today, the very idea seems so absurd, so much like a Rudyard Kipling Just So story, that I put it on a par with How the Elephant Got Its Trunk.
Well, you say quasi-human, but wouldn't the right term be supernatural?
No, because I think these supernatural notions, you see, that's having the best of both worlds. They imply that it's an agency which has got many of the properties which something must have in order to be an agent, something which acts out of purpose and intent, more translucent, more supernatural. And I cannot quite make sense of that as a concept. It's what the philosophers would call an incoherent notion.
If you reject the idea of God, the supernatural being who must be revered, worshipped, all the observances, the rituals, with all the damage which you believe is done in the name of religion, which I'm very sympathetic to, what about the definition of religion itself as something broad, like the experience of the sacred. Does that have any meaning for you?
I think that most people, unless they are really very oafish clods, find that there is something deeply mysterious and mind-stopping, and in some ways thought-stopping, about the business of being alive at all. I mean, it's a very paradoxical state of affairs that something made of such unpromising material could be self-conscious and see itself as a being in a world which is larger than itself, and having a large, dark periphery which cannot be penetrated. Now, religious people say that this, of course, is the residence of the gods, that the place beyond which human thought cannot reach must be the place in which the gods live. Well, that seems to me to be a piece of unwarranted legislation, to say that's where God is because we can't reach it. Seems to me to be quite sufficient to be awestruck by the impenetrable nature of being conscious at all, of being here, of the act of being conscious of being here. Now, usually when I say that, some crouching cleric leaps out of the laurel bushes and say, you know, you really are a Christian after all, or you really are deeply religious. Well, if that's what being deeply religious is, all right, I'll say that I am. But you see, the consequences of that confession, that admission, is usually, you are therefore, as it were, on the edge of subscribing to one or other of the world religions. And that's not the case. If that's what you call religious, that's fine. But I don't go further than that. It seems to me to be dumbstruck and awestruck by our condition is spiritual enough to be getting on with. Thank you very much.
So it's perfectly acceptable for you within yourself to be a rationalist and an atheist and have a sense of mystery. There's no contradiction in there.
No, I think that it would be very irrational to be able to stand in the midst of one's own consciousness, this view from somewhere, as opposed to this notional thing which the philosopher Tom Nagel calls the view from nowhere. In other words, the total world view that might be had by some hypothetical entity not embodied in the way that we are. To have such a position, to be embodied, to be conscious in the way that we are, is both to have the possibility of rational thought, and at the same time to realize that there is a limit beyond which rational thought, ordinary perception, that will not reach. You see, I've recently confronted a lot of controversy with some of my scientific colleagues on the question of consciousness being ultimately reducible to neurophysiology. Now, I happen to think that consciousness is the product of nothing other than brains and nerves, and nerve endings and synapses and neurotransmitters. I don't think that we are conscious by virtue of some superadded supernatural principle which makes us conscious. But at the same time, while I think that there's nothing other than brains or nerves and neurons and neurotransmitters, I think that how it is that all that sort of wet stuff can produce consciousness is probably beyond the grasp of consciousness.
But you know, you say you reject the idea of God, and it's an absurdity to you, this sort of ludicrous notion. Is it not possible that the idea of God, the need for God, the longing for God, however one puts it, is simply a part of that consciousness that you describe, which is unknowable?
No.
That they go together, that they are part and parcel of the same thing?
No, I think you have to be very cautious in your state of awestruck, puzzled, unknowing. Not to go beyond it and say, well, therefore there must be an explanation for it. You see, most of the theology that I've heard is an attempt to go beyond that state of willing, enthusiastic unknowing to a state of pseudo-knowing, which is what religion seems to me to be. It's a series of provisional hypotheses trumped up to account for the fact that we don't know what it's like or how it is that we come to be the sort of things that we are. I think one should be perfectly satisfied to stand awestruck on the shores of our own world and simply say it is unknowable to us how we come to be in a situation to be knowing things at all. Things at all.
If you reject, as we've established, religion as observance, and religion as personal God, and also religion as theology, philosophy, the question why should not be asked. What about religion as ethical system? I mean, does that appeal to you? the great religions, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, all have at their center a comprehensive moral framework.
Well, I think one would be historically foolish to deny the part that these monotheistic religions have played in reformulating moral attitudes and in giving some sort of shape and structure, and also in the end a series of sort of quasi-legal sanctions to those moral ideas. But I sometimes ask myself, well now, did the notion of moral sympathy, that peculiar sort of sympathetic individualism which came from the Judeo-Christian tradition, is it the result of this particular monotheistic religion, or is the monotheistic religion the result of people having changed their minds of what it was like to be a human being in relationship to others? You see, I think that I take a biological view of all these things ultimately. Altruism, biological altruism, as you know, the games theorists in biology have shown, it turns out to be a very a prudential strategy, which is rather good. It's a good way of getting a group to survive. If you start mind reading, anticipating the thoughts of others for purely technical purposes, very soon you bump up against the idea of mind reading people's feelings rather than simply their technical thoughts. And I think out of that comes a much more sophisticated moral system, which involves doing unto others what you would like to have done unto yourself. Seeing others as being like yourself in the way of feelings and not merely thoughts lays the ground of morality without, in fact, having to invoke supernatural sanctions for it.
If the longing for God is, in fact, a longing for good, and the human being is capable of practicing it in the way you described, in the most sophisticated way as well as the most loving and giving way, could not that lead, or does it in you, to any form of humanism? That, in fact, what a piece of work is man, without going to the end of that speech, that we are capable of the most tremendous self-sacrifice and great love, and that is an expression of a form of Godhead?
No, I don't think it is. It's an expression of humanity. It's the state of the art of this funny twig on the evolutionary tree. Now, the survival strategy which bootstrapped the human enterprise into the extraordinary sort of productive thing that it was this extraordinary capacity to like being liked by other people, to like feeling as they feel, to cooperate with their feelings, to enjoy friends, and to love children, and to honor parents, and so forth. All of these horizontal and vertical alliances and affinities, which are shown in a primitive, unself-conscious way by our lower primate ancestors and cousins, which we have developed to such an extraordinary extent, is simply the state of the art of this very eccentric and peculiar part of the evolutionary tree. It's not the top of the evolutionary tree, as Stephen Gould has shown in his recent book. It's just simply the funny, peculiar side twig that this funny little group of African primates got together. It turns out to have been extraordinarily productive in this odd, rather squalid province on the northwest of the cosmos.
When people hear you talk like that, it's almost a reductio ad absurdum. I can imagine people feeling quite offended that you so wish to reduce it all. At the same time as
I can't understand that anyone could see it as being reduced. It simply is a statement of the extraordinary situation in which we find ourselves. It happens to be in the midst of a majestically mysterious cosmos. And that should be enough. Asking for more seems to be looking for a cabaret after the last movement of the Ninth Symphony.
someone like Lord Healy, who describes himself as an agnostic, indeed as a devout skeptic, says that, in fact, for him, the supreme manifestation of something approaching divinity is in art, music, literature. Do you ever approach that when you read Shakespeare or go into a church?
I think that's sentimental tosh. I think that it's another way in which the crouching clergyman in the laurel bushes it encourages the crouching clergyman to leap out and say, "Ah, you're Christian all along. Come along and be confirmed." It's the religion and art and the things which we value and cherish so much and which move us to tears and give us a sense of the mystery of our being are simply the things that give us an expression of the mystery of our being. They are not an expression of a divinity that lies beyond themselves. The divinity is within the odd biological arrangement which was capable of doing such things. And we're in the middle of that biology and are moved by it, and it's not surprising that we are moved by it, because that's the way we are wired.
Are you a humanist?
No, you see, I reject all these labels like atheism or humanism. I simply am a person who is aware of being the sort of thing that we seem to be.
Far from me to put any labels on you or anybody else for that matter, but I always like the idea of humanism because it seems to me to be very celebratory, whereas calling someone agnostic or an atheist is negative or has a negative connotation. Everything you've said about man and this funny little twig that we are and where we are seems to me to be profoundly celebratory.
Well, of course I celebrate and feel some sort of pride in being on this twig. It's so much more interesting, I suspect, than it might have been to have been a trilobite. As the philosopher I mentioned earlier, Tom Nagel, said in his wonderful essay that there is something it is like to be a bat. There must be, as opposed to there being there's nothing it's like to be a stone, but there must be something it's like to be a bat and live in the middle of a life based on echolocation. But it's jolly uninteresting compared to the thing it's like to be us. And one of the ways in which we know what it's like to be us is to stand in the middle of the nave of Chartres Cathedral and look towards the great rose window, or to look at the great royal door. Not because it gives intimations of the divinity which inspired such constructions, but because it gives intimations of the biological majesty of the state of the art that produced such constructions. It is the weird thing of nature having the capacity to rear up and look at itself. That seems to me to be deeply spiritual, if you like, if as people urgently want one to say, one is spiritual. All right, that's what being spiritual is, to be dumbstruck in front of the impenetrable mystery of nature being conscious of itself in this funny little province of the universe, where elsewhere nature goes about its sort of curious, boring, indifferent business without being aware of what it's up to. And this funny little twig somehow rears up and looks up its own nostril.
At its own soul? Does the word soul
I don't
have any meaning to it?
No, none at all. I mean, if soul is the name that you want to give to the biological arrangement which is conscious of itself, which has concerns for itself and then concerns for others which seem to be conscious like itself, all right, I'll call that soul, except that it encourages the crouching clergyman in the laurel bushes to leap out and say, you're Christian all along, you acknowledge the soul. Because he has different ideas of what I mean by it and wants me to mean what he means by it, and I'll be damned if I will.
Why are you so afraid of crouching clergymen?
Because of their triumphant desire to have people subscribe to the Kipling nonsense that they peddle.
Do you feel that they've sort of had a
divine, and particularly when people believe that they have been appointed in some way by God, and they're prepared therefore to believe that they've, like some sort of business which bears the royal arms on the side and say by appointment to the royal household. It seems to me that when it comes to that sort of speculation about how things are, the best state of affairs is to simply say, it is not given to us to know. Now, I again reject labels on this. I hate to use the word agnosticism because it sounds like a not knowing which is provisional, as it were, like the person who's at the bottom of the Gallup polls, waiting for more persuasive candidate to come to the door. Oh, is that what you mean by doing? No, in that case I'll sign on. My agnosia is the deep agnosia of I haven't the faintest idea what sort of thing we're in the middle of, and I don't think, in fact I know, that there's no one who's going to be able to tell me.
Do you identify within yourself any residual longing for the idea of life after death to be true?
Even if I could make sense of the notion, and in a moment I'll explain to you why I think it's an incoherent claim. it seems to me to be quite insufferable, the thought of a life after this, recognizably different from this. You see, the important point about being a person is that it's to do with being embodied, being in this body rather than another, being here rather than there, and above all, being endowed with the physical powers that are associated with the particular body that I have, and the particular bodies that other people have, which define personality and define personhood. I can't make sense of the idea of having an existence without being embodied, and certainly without being physically embodied in the sort of thing which I think is a human body. So that there are different sorts of scripts for a posthumous existence, all of which I find incoherent. The idea that I continue to be the person that I am, albeit a cockroach, is something which I can't make logical sense of. How would it know that it had once been me? Would it simply find itself, as it were, like me, locked into a very small trunk, complaining querulously, let me out of this mobile valise, which I seem to be moving around in, very small valise? How would it know that it really was me inside this six-legged portmanteau? I claim that there would be no way in which it could I could re-identify myself as being myself under those circs.
That's why you'd be being punished.
Well, I mean,
by not being yourself.
Well, in which case, the punishment is not being inflicted in any meaningful way. In order for a punishment to be inflicted, the recipient of the punishment must know that it is, in fact, the recipient of the punishment. The cockroach, whatever it was. And, of course, as I said earlier about trilobites, it is in the nature of trilobites that there is not much it's like to be them. And I think that there's not much it's like to be a cockroach. Now, see, the reincarnationists would say, oh, well, there's not much it's like to be a cockroach of the ordinary sort. But if, amongst all those cockroaches, one or other of them is either you or Marie Antoinette or Shirley MacLaine, then it's a very special sort of thing, and it's rather like being Shirley MacLaine. Well, my claim is that there's no way in which a thing like a cockroach could entertain thoughts that Shirley MacLaine would entertain while in the body of Shirley MacLaine. And I think also the same goes for Shirley MacLaine as Marie Antoinette, that Marie Antoinette is working full-time at being Marie Antoinette, and there's no room for her to be the Shirley MacLaine that retrospectively claimed it was once Marie Antoinette. Otherwise, you might have to entertain the thought that Marie Antoinette in the tumbril would comfort her maid by saying, you know, all this is probably for the best because, you know, I am going to be Shirley MacLaine sometime or other, whoever that is. You see, you're working flat out at being whoever you are. You haven't got spare time or spare personhood to entertain the possibility of the subsequent person that the reincarnationists say you might eventually be. It seems to me to be a nonsensical idea. And a cognate notion is the idea of surviving death, not as a cockroach, nor as Marie Antoinette, nor as Shirley MacLaine, but just simply as me, but not embodied. Me in heaven, as this unhoused version of myself, unhoused in body, but nevertheless still myself. It seems to be an incoherent notion, just as incoherent as me as cockroach.
So what happens when you die?
Nothing more mysterious than what happens when my car packs up irreversibly and someone says it's a write-off. I don't say, and no one ever says of motor cars, well, it's gone somewhere better. It's gone to the great Vauxhall Valhalla in the sky, where the Vauxhalls will never rot, where there will never be punctures. It is in the nature of Vauxhalls that they stop being the sort of thing that makes them interesting as Vauxhalls. Well, we are more complicated than Vauxhalls, much more complicated. And one of the things that makes us more complicated is that we're conscious of being the sort of things that we are in the way that Vauxhalls aren't. But that doesn't justify us in saying that the conscious part of being us goes elsewhere while the body is simply, as we're scrapped. I think that when we're scrapped, we're scrapped. And That's fine. I mean, everyone has reasons to enjoy the ride.
Well, is this what keeps you going? Because, I mean, you've done enormous numbers of things in your life, more than most people, right across lots of disciplines. Do you have any sense of pilgrimage, of quest?
No, it's just interesting being here. You know, I was once struck by a story that was told to me by an experimental psychologist many years ago, when he said that you can, you know, usually when you have experimental animals like monkeys and so forth, you give them an incentive in the way of food, and or drink, or sex, or something. Well, it's been found that monkeys certainly, will do things where the only reward is a further view of another room. If that's the only reward, they will perform arduous tasks for the purpose of getting a better view of things. And I think that seems to me to be the condition in which I find myself. I'm a monkey that is quite happy to get further views of what there is to be seen. And if someone offers me some more holes against which I can press my bloodshot eyeball, I'll pay for admission.
And move on to the next room?
Yeah.
And
Or perhaps not even move on to the next room. I mean, often these views are of rooms into which you're not allowed to go and see the full view. One of the most enchanting toys is that beautiful thing in the National Gallery called the Hoogstraten box, which has a little eye hole into which you look at a painted trompe-l'oeil Dutch interior. Now, you can't actually, from any particular one viewpoint, see the whole of the room. But it is so intriguing to be able to see anything of the room that you will keep your eye pressed to that hole, because it's more interesting than keeping your eyes shut.